Sometimes the most unexpected encounters happen when the heart is at its most fragile. On a quiet plane ride, a struggling single father tries to comfort his little girl, but what unfolds next will change the course of their lives in ways he never could have imagined. It's a story of hope, quiet resilience, and the simple moments that can turn into something extraordinary. If you believe in the power of small kindnesses and second chances, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and stay with us until the end, because sometimes the best parts of the story are the ones you never see coming. Now let's begin. Struggling single dad was comforting his daughter on a plane. Then she called the billionaire mom. The plane hummed softly beneath them, a steady vibration like the pulse of some giant sleeping creature. Outside the small oval window, the evening sky had melted into hues of deep indigo, streaked with the last golden brushstrokes of the sun's farewell. Rows of tired passengers leaned back against their seats, lost in books, movies, or dreams. Ethan Miller shifted uncomfortably, trying for the third time to settle his daughter more securely against his chest. Sophie, 5 years old and small for her age, was fighting sleep with the stubborn determination only children seem to possess. Her blonde curls, mussed from a long day of travel, brushed against the rough fabric of his worn denim jacket. "Daddy," she whimpered, her voice raw with exhaustion. "I want Mommy." Ethan's heart clenched so hard it almost stole his breath. He tightened his arms around her, gently rocking her back and forth. "I know, sweetheart," he murmured into her hair, his voice catching. "I know you do." But knowing wasn't the same as fixing it, and there were some wounds no amount of love could completely heal. Across the aisle, a few curious glances flickered their way. Some sympathetic, some simply annoyed at the disturbance. Ethan ignored them. Let them judge. They hadn't held Sophie at 3 in the morning when she woke up crying, or explained for the 100th time why Mommy couldn't come back. He pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, feeling her small body trembling against him. "We're almost there, Peanut," he whispered. "Just a little longer, okay? You're doing so good." The words came out steady, warm, but inside Ethan was unraveling, tired, stretched thin, trying to be father and mother, protector and provider, without ever showing the cracks spidering beneath the surface. The seat beside them was empty, a small mercy. Ethan shifted Sophie into it carefully, easing the strain on his aching arms. She clung to his sleeve even in sleep, her small hand wrapping around his calloused fingers with surprising strength. Across the aisle, Charlotte Hayes pretended to adjust the settings on her seat screen, but her eyes kept drifting back to the father and daughter. Something about them pierced right through her usual careful detachment. The weary tenderness in the man's face, the absolute trust in the little girl's grip. It reminded Charlotte of something she had long ago buried under layers of polished ambition and lonely hotel rooms. A quiet longing for family, for roots, for something real. She closed her eyes briefly, as if trying to block the feeling. It was ridiculous. She was Charlotte Hayes, CEO of Hayes Tech Solutions, worth billions on paper. She lived in penthouses and traveled in private jets. She didn't get sentimental over strangers on commercial flights. And yet, here she was. When she opened her eyes again, the little girl was crying quietly, a small, broken sound that tugged at Charlotte's chest like a child pulling on a mother's sleeve. Without thinking, she reached into her handbag and pulled out a small plush bunny, a leftover from a recent charity event where she had handed out toys to underprivileged children. The bunny was cream-colored, with long, floppy ears and a pink ribbon around its neck. She hesitated. This wasn't like her. She didn't cross lines. She didn't get involved. But maybe just this once. Charlotte unbuckled her seatbelt and rose, smoothing down the creases in her elegant navy blue sweater dress. She crossed the aisle, feeling the weight of several surprised glances trail after her. "Excuse me," she said softly. Ethan looked up, startled, his face guarded, weary. He shifted instinctively as if to shield Sophie. Charlotte crouched slightly, bringing herself to Sophie's level. "I couldn't help but notice she's having a rough time," she said, offering the bunny with an uncertain smile. "Maybe this will help." Sophie blinked sleepily up at her, her tear-streaked cheeks flushing pink. For a long moment, no one moved. Then with a tentative hand, Sophie reached out and took the bunny, clutching it to her chest. And then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, she said, "Mommy?" The word hung in the air like a shot fired in a silent cathedral. Ethan stiffened, his mouth opened, then closed again, the color draining from his face. He looked like a man gut-punched by something he hadn't seen coming. Charlotte froze, the bunny still dangling lightly from her fingertips. Her heart gave a strange, aching lurch. She opened her mouth to correct the little girl, to explain, but no words came. Instead, she simply smiled, a smile so gentle, so full of unshed tears, that it softened the sharp edges of her usually impenetrable facade. "You're safe, sweetheart," she said, brushing a stray curl from Sophie's forehead. "I promise." Ethan cleared his throat, visibly struggling to regain his composure. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely. She lost her mom a while back. She gets confused sometimes." Charlotte shook her head immediately. "No apology needed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's lucky to have you." For a moment longer, the three of them lingered there in that fragile bubble, a little island of tenderness adrift in a sea of disconnected strangers. Then Charlotte straightened, smoothing her dress again with practiced hands. "If you need anything, I'm just over there," she said, nodding toward her seat. Ethan nodded stiffly, gratitude flickering behind the exhaustion in his eyes. As Charlotte walked back across the aisle, she felt an unfamiliar tightness in her chest. Something had shifted, and she wasn't sure she could, or even wanted to, shift it back. She settled into her seat and stared blindly at the screen in front of her, the hum of the plane filling her ears. In her lap, her hands trembled slightly. For the first time in a long time, Charlotte Hayes realized that all the money in the world couldn't quiet the ache of an empty heart. And somewhere in the rows behind her, a little girl slept soundly at last, clutching a small plush bunny like a lifeline. The city lights of Denver slipped away beneath them, a glittering sea fading into the shadows of night. Up here, above the sleeping world, the plane was a cocoon of dimmed lights and murmured voices, punctuated only by the occasional ding of a call button or the rustle of a blanket. Charlotte Hayes leaned her head lightly against the cool pane of the window, her arms folded neatly across her lap. From this height, everything earthly seemed so small, so far removed from the demands that usually pressed against her from every side. She let out a slow breath, fogging a small patch of glass in front of her. With the back of her hand, she wiped it clean, more out of habit than necessity. In her world, there were no moments wasted. Every breath, every glance, every conversation was calculated, measured, purposeful. But now, sitting alone with nothing but the endless sky for company, Charlotte felt a rare, unsettling stillness settle into her chest, and she didn't like it. She adjusted the slim bracelet on her wrist, a delicate chain of white gold, a gift from a board of directors she barely tolerated, and shifted in her seat. She had work emails to answer, deals to finalize. Her assistant had uploaded briefing documents to her tablet before takeoff. There was always something to do, some metric to chase, yet her fingers hovered idly over the tablet screen, unmoving. Across the aisle, the father and daughter who had caught her attention earlier were now quiet. The little girl, Sophie, she remembered the father murmuring the name, had finally drifted into a fitful sleep, her small hand tangled tightly in the man's shirt. Charlotte watched them out of the corner of her eye, feeling a strange ache she couldn't quite explain. She saw the way the man's hand rested lightly on the child's back, never fully relaxed, as if always ready to shield her from some unseen threat. His body curved protectively around Sophie even in sleep, his face still etched with lines of worry and bone-deep exhaustion. It was not the exhaustion of too many meetings or jet lag. No, this was something different. This was the kind of tiredness that came from carrying another person's entire world on your back. Charlotte's gaze softened despite herself. He was not particularly striking. In another setting, in a different life, she might have passed him without a second thought. His clothes were simple, practical. His boots were scuffed from hard work, not bought distressed from some designer boutique. His hair was tousled in a way that spoke more of long days and short nights than of any deliberate style. But there was something about him, something steady, something deeply, quietly good. She could feel it like a current in the air between them. Charlotte closed her eyes, willing herself to focus on the sterile numbers and projections that usually grounded her. "You don't know them," It's none of your business. And yet, the image of the little girl, clutching the bunny and whispering, "Mommy," with such desperate hope, replayed in her mind like an old, scratched film reel. Charlotte swallowed hard. No amount of money, no glittering charity galas or media accolades could buy what that little girl needed most: a mother's arms, a mother's heart. And there in that moment, Charlotte faced a hollow truth she had been skillfully ignoring for years. Her life, for all its grandeur, was empty in the places that mattered most. Outside the window, the stars blinked coldly, indifferent. She had spent so long chasing everything, success, respect, independence, that somewhere along the way, she had missed the quiet life she had once dreamed of. A small house with a white fence, children's laughter echoing down a hallway, arms that waited for her at the end of a long day. She had traded all that away for boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. Charlotte opened her eyes again and shifted her gaze downward. The man, Ethan, she thought his name was, stirred slightly, brushing a protective hand over Sophie's forehead before settling back into uneasy sleep. Her chest tightened. There was something profoundly beautiful about them, in their worn-out clothes and their heartbreak. They weren't polished or perfect, but they were real. And maybe that was what she envied most: realness, raw, unvarnished love. Charlotte pressed her hand lightly to the window, feeling the faint vibration of the plane beneath her palm. How long had it been since she had touched someone simply for comfort? Since someone had reached for her without an agenda or expectation? Years, maybe decades. Her life was measured in quarterly earnings reports, in acquisitions and mergers, not in small hands reaching up in trust or whispered goodnights in the dark. She hadn't meant to get so lost. A low murmur drew her attention back to the aisle. The flight attendant was moving quietly between rows, offering water to passengers still awake. Charlotte shook her head politely when the woman paused beside her, offering a gentle smile she didn't quite feel. No, she didn't need water. She needed something else, something she wasn't sure she could name. Across the aisle, Sophie shifted, her small fingers releasing Ethan's shirt momentarily before curling back in reflexive search for safety. Before Charlotte could even think, she had unbuckled her seatbelt again and reached into her handbag for a light blanket she always carried. She rose, careful and quiet, and approached them. Gently, she draped the blanket over both of them, tucking it around Sophie's tiny frame without waking her. Ethan stirred but didn't wake. His hand found Sophie's instinctively, even in sleep. Charlotte stood there for a moment longer than necessary, her hand brushing the worn fabric of Ethan's jacket. She could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of his breath. It was strange. She had signed deals that changed industries, shaken hands with presidents and kings. And yet here, tucking a blanket around a sleeping child, she felt more human than she had in years. She returned to her seat, her heart strangely full and aching all at once. Outside the window, the stars continued their cold, brilliant dance. But inside the plane, something warm had begun to thaw inside Charlotte Hayes. A spark of longing, a fragile flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't finished yet. Maybe there was still a different kind of success waiting for her, if only she was brave enough to reach for it. The plane cruised steadily through the night sky, the quiet hum settling over the cabin like a soft, constant lullaby. Most passengers had surrendered to sleep or distraction, their faces slackened in the muted blue glow of overhead lights. Ethan Miller sat rigidly in his seat, a subtle tension still coiled in his shoulders despite the blanket now draped over him and Sophie. He hadn't missed it, the gentle hands that had tucked it around them, the kindness he wasn't sure he deserved. Across the aisle, he caught a glimpse of the woman who had offered it, Charlotte Hayes. She sat perfectly still, her posture elegant yet somehow weary, her gaze fixed out the window, lost somewhere in the blackness beyond. Ethan swallowed, a complicated swirl of gratitude and discomfort twisting in his chest. He wasn't used to kindness from strangers. Kindness, in his world, usually came with a price, or pity, and neither sat well with him. Still, he couldn't deny the warmth spreading through his body, not from the blanket, but from something deeper, something quieter. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that even in the vast indifference of the world, a small hand could still reach out. He shifted slightly, careful not to wake Sophie. She was breathing deeply now, her little body finally at rest, the plush bunny cradled tightly in her arms. Ethan ran a rough hand over his face. God, he was tired. Tired in ways sleep couldn't fix. It was more than the miles traveled, more than the endless days spent scraping by for Sophie's sake. It was the exhaustion of carrying invisible burdens. Grief, guilt, fear, all while trying to smile brightly enough that Sophie wouldn't see the cracks. A small sob hiccuped from Sophie's lips, and without thinking, Ethan leaned down, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "I've got you, Peanut," he whispered, barely more than breath. "I'm right here." The words steadied him as much as they did her. When he glanced up again, he found Charlotte watching. Their eyes met across the aisle, just for a moment, and Ethan saw something in her expression that surprised him. Not judgment, not curiosity, recognition. As if she too understood what it was to carry a loneliness that no one else could see. Charlotte smiled, soft and tentative, then looked away, fiddling with the simple silver ring she wore on her right hand. A nervous habit, he realized. Maybe she wasn't as untouchable as she seemed. Maybe none of them were. The cabin lights dimmed further, signaling the approach of midnight. A flight attendant glided by, pausing to check if Charlotte needed anything. She shook her head politely, then, after a brief hesitation, reached into the seat pocket in front of her and pulled out a small notebook and a pen. Ethan watched, curious despite himself. Charlotte opened the notebook to a fresh page and began to write. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Every so often she would pause, tapping the pen lightly against her lip, lost in thought. What was she writing, he wondered? Business plans? A to-do list for tomorrow's empire building? He almost laughed at himself, as if someone like her had any room in her life for moments as messy and tangled as his. Still, when she finished, she tore the page carefully from the notebook, folded it twice, and tucked it into a slim envelope. For a moment, she simply stared at it, her fingers trailing the edges. Then, gathering a breath like someone about to leap into cold water, she stood and crossed the aisle once more. Ethan straightened automatically, protective instincts flaring. Sophie stirred against him but didn't wake. Charlotte crouched again at their side, her voice low, almost hesitant. "I hope you don't mind," she said, offering him the envelope. "It's nothing, just a little something that might help." Ethan hesitated, every muscle in his body tight with uncertainty. Pride warred with practicality, with gratitude, with suspicion born of too many hard years. But something in Charlotte's face, the softness, the genuine care, cut through all of it. He accepted the envelope with a quiet nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Charlotte smiled again, a little more surely this time. "You're doing a great job," she said almost fiercely. "Don't ever think otherwise." And before Ethan could respond, before the lump in his throat could loosen enough to let him speak, she stood and returned to her seat. Ethan sat there for a long minute, staring at the envelope as if it were something fragile, sacred. Finally, with careful fingers, he opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. "For when it feels too heavy, you're not alone. See, Sunarm." And folded behind the note, tucked almost shyly, was a small gift card to a family-owned diner. Nothing extravagant, but enough to cover a warm meal or two for him and Sophie. Ethan exhaled a long breath, pressing the note against his chest for a moment before slipping it carefully into his jacket pocket. He leaned back in his seat, the tightness in his chest easing, just a little. It wasn't the gift card. It wasn't even the meal. It was the reminder that someone who didn't owe him anything, had seen him, really seen him. That in this vast, noisy world, someone still believed that a small gesture could matter. Across the aisle, Charlotte had closed her eyes again, the notebook resting forgotten in her lap. Ethan turned his gaze back to Sophie, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Maybe tonight wasn't just another long, lonely night. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. He closed his eyes, letting the steady hum of the plane carry him and Sophie forward into whatever came next. And across the aisle, Charlotte Hayes, billionaire, loner, dreamer, clutched a small hope against her heart, that maybe she had just begun to find her way home too. The minutes stretched into a quiet eternity inside the plane. The cabin lights dimmed low, casting a soft twilight over the rows of slumbering passengers. Ethan shifted slightly, careful not to jostle Sophie as she stirred against him. Her little fingers twitched in sleep, still wrapped around the worn bunny Charlotte had given her. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, and for the first time that day, Ethan allowed himself to relax. Across the aisle, Charlotte pretended to sleep. Her eyes were closed, her breathing even, but her mind was anything but still. She could feel Ethan's presence like a steady heartbeat across the aisle. The protective way he held his daughter, the bone-deep tenderness in every unconscious movement. It stirred something in her, something she wasn't sure she had the right to feel. She wasn't a mother. She wasn't even close. But watching him, she found herself wondering what it would be like to be needed like that, to have tiny arms wrap around her neck, not because of who she was or what she owned, but simply because she was home. A soft whimper broke the hush. Charlotte's eyes snapped open. Sophie was stirring again, her small body wriggling restlessly in her sleep, her bunny dropping to the floor with a soft thud. Ethan moved quickly, reaching to retrieve it, but Sophie, half awake and disoriented, reached out blindly toward the aisle. Toward Charlotte. "Mommy?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. The single word cracked open the stillness like a stone thrown into a mirror. Ethan froze halfway through picking up the bunny, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. Charlotte's breath caught painfully in her chest. There was no malice in the word, no calculation, just the pure, aching instinct of a child reaching for comfort. Slowly, Charlotte unbuckled her seatbelt. She knelt in the aisle, bringing herself level with Sophie's sleepy, tear-dampened face. "I'm right here, sweet girl," Charlotte said softly, her voice trembling despite herself. She reached out, gently brushing a stray curl from Sophie's forehead. Sophie smiled in her sleep and curled into the touch without hesitation. Ethan's heart twisted violently at the sight. He started, but the words wouldn't come. He looked from Charlotte to Sophie and back again, guilt and gratitude and raw grief warring inside him. Charlotte met his eyes, and for a long, breathless moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to, because in that suspended sliver of time, something passed between them. A fragile, silent understanding. This wasn't about mistakes or pretenses. It wasn't about what made sense on paper. It was about a tired little girl who had reached out blindly for love and found it. Ethan sank back into his seat, running a trembling hand through his hair. His voice, when it finally came, was rough with emotion. "She lost her mom," he said, his throat tight. "Cancer, 2 years ago." Charlotte nodded, her hand still resting lightly against Sophie's back. "I figured," she said gently. "She misses her. Of course she does." Ethan swallowed hard, blinking back the sudden sting in his eyes. "I'm sorry if it made you uncomfortable," he said hoarsely. "She doesn't usually—" "Don't!" Charlotte interrupted, her voice fierce and soft all at once. "Don't apologize for her, or for loving her so well she still believes in the kindness of strangers." Ethan looked down, unable to meet her gaze, his chest aching with a gratitude too big for words. Charlotte adjusted the blanket carefully around Sophie, tucking it under her chin with a tenderness that made Ethan's throat close. Then slowly she rose and slipped back into her seat, folding her hands tightly in her lap. For a long time, the only sounds were the steady hum of the engines and the rhythmic breathing of the passengers around them. Ethan leaned back, his head resting against the seat, and stared at the ceiling. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know what her life looked like when she wasn't wrapped in expensive cashmere and sipping bottled water from first-class service trays. But he knew kindness when he saw it. He knew gentleness. And right now, in the middle of a darkened airplane, somewhere between Denver and Atlanta, he knew one other thing too. He wasn't as alone as he thought. Charlotte pressed her forehead lightly against the window pane, letting the chill seep into her skin. The city lights below sparkled like scattered diamonds across a black velvet sea. She thought about the life she had built, the towering offices, the sleek homes, the endless accolades, and how none of it had ever filled the quiet ache that had lived inside her for as long as she could remember. And now here was this tiny girl, reaching for her without hesitation. This rugged man trusting her, if only for a moment, with the most precious thing in his world. Charlotte blinked hard against the sudden blur of tears. Maybe, she thought, it's not too late. Maybe life had more than one kind of success to offer. Maybe it was built, not with billion-dollar deals, but with small moments like these. Moments when someone reached out and someone else chose to reach back. She rested her hand lightly over her heart, feeling the steady thrum beneath her palm. Hope. Fragile. Terrifying. Alive. The plane dipped slightly as the captain announced their initial descent. Passengers stirred, seatbelts clicked, the small ecosystem of the cabin waking from its slumber. Charlotte glanced across the aisle one last time. Ethan was awake, his hand resting protectively over Sophie's chest, his eyes distant but somehow lighter than before. She smiled to herself, a soft, private thing. Wherever this strange new thread was leading, she wasn't afraid to follow it. For the first time in a very long time, Charlotte Hayes realized she was ready. Ready for something real, ready for something more. The plane kissed the tarmac with a soft jolt, tires hissing against the asphalt. Around them, the cabin stirred awake, seatbelts unbuckling, bags rustling, conversations blooming in hushed, weary tones. Ethan tightened his grip on Sophie as the plane taxied toward the gate. She mumbled something unintelligible against his shoulder, still half lost in dreams. The bunny slipped from her hands again, but Ethan caught it, tucking it safely between them. He glanced sideways, heart thudding. Charlotte was gathering her things with effortless efficiency, sliding a sleek tablet into a designer handbag, adjusting the tailored drape of her coat with practiced hands. Polished, composed, untouchable. It struck him, suddenly and sharply, how different they were. Ethan wore jeans that had seen better days, scuffed boots, and a jacket patched once at the elbow. His entire life fit into the battered duffel shoved under his seat. He had no fancy briefcase, no glittering resume, just a little girl clinging to him and a stubborn will to survive. Beside Charlotte Hayes, Woman of the Year, Forbes listed billionaire, he felt like a man made of dust and patched dreams. The seatbelt light dinged off. Passengers began rising, stretching stiff limbs, shuffling forward with the anxious energy of caged animals sensing freedom. Charlotte looked over and smiled. Small, hesitant, genuine. "You two have somewhere to be once we land?" she asked, voice low, as if trying not to intrude. Ethan's throat tightened. He shifted Sophie carefully, standing with an awkward grace. "We'll find our way," he said, offering a polite but distant nod. "Thanks again. For everything." Charlotte hesitated. For a moment it seemed like she might say more, but then she simply pressed her lips together and nodded, her smile fading into something sadder, quieter. The aisle clogged quickly, a bottleneck of tired bodies. Ethan moved slowly, shielding Sophie from errant elbows and swinging bags. He felt Charlotte a few steps behind him, could almost sense the weight of her gaze, but he didn't turn around. He couldn't. The distance between them had grown too wide, too fast. Not because of anything she had done, but because standing beside her, Ethan was acutely, painfully aware of all the things he wasn't. The terminal was a blur of faces and noise and harsh fluorescent light. Announcements crackled overhead. Wheels squeaked against tile. The air smelled of coffee, jet fuel, and tired hopes. Ethan maneuvered through the crowd, Sophie heavy in his arms now, her head drooping against his shoulder. His duffel thumped against his hip with every step. Somewhere behind him, Charlotte moved with the easy certainty of someone accustomed to belonging in every room she entered. A black car service would be waiting for her. A driver in a crisp suit, a polished ride, a life of ordered efficiency. He, meanwhile, would be catching the late shuttle to a budget motel near the city outskirts. Hoping Sophie didn't notice the cracked walls or the threadbare sheets, he adjusted Sophie gently and forced the bitterness down. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. It was just the way the world worked. Some people soared in private jets, and others stitched their lives together one paycheck at a time. Still, when he caught a glimpse of her ahead at baggage claim, standing tall and elegant, her coat falling around her like water, something in him ached. For a world he could never give Sophie. For a woman he had no right to want. He turned away sharply, focusing on the worn carpet at his feet. "Stay in your lane, Miller." Charlotte stood by the carousel, watching the endless river of suitcases spin by. She should have called her driver by now. She should have been halfway to her penthouse already, trading one kind of loneliness for another. But she lingered, her hands clutching the strap of her bag so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She had seen the moment it happened, the flicker in Ethan's eyes when he realized who she was, what she was. It wasn't the first time someone had pulled away, and it still hurt more than she wanted to admit. She didn't blame him. Not really. Their lives were written in different languages, stitched together from threads that would never quite match. But still, she wished. She wished she could cross that distance. She wished he would look at her and see not the billionaire, not the symbol, but just a woman, messy, longing, terrified, trying to find her way. Charlotte bit her lip hard and turned away from the carousel empty-handed. Her luggage would find its way to her. It always did. Some things, she thought bitterly, were easier to reclaim than others. Across the terminal, she spotted Ethan, his duffel slung over one shoulder, Sophie sagging against his chest. Something inside her cracked. Without thinking, without planning, she started toward them. Not fast, not loud, just steady. Ethan heard the click of heels behind him before he saw her. He turned, heart hammering, and found Charlotte there, just a few steps away, hands empty, face open. "Hey," she said, slightly breathless. Do you have a ride?" He shook his head automatically, his mouth too dry to answer. Charlotte hesitated, searching his face. Then she smiled. Small, a little shaky, but real. "I'm not offering charity," she said, reading him too easily. "Just a company." Ethan hesitated, Sophie's weight heavy in his arms, pride and longing battling inside him. He wanted to say no, wanted to protect himself, protect Sophie from hopes too big, too dangerous. But when he looked into Charlotte's eyes, really looked, he saw no pity there. Only an invitation, a bridge, offered in trembling hands. And for once, maybe, he didn't have to cross it alone. Ethan exhaled slowly and nodded. Charlotte's smile widened, soft and luminous. They fell into step together, a small, fragile trio moving toward the sliding glass doors in the night beyond. And though the distance between their worlds hadn't disappeared, for the first time, it didn't seem quite so impossible to cross. The night air outside the airport was cool and crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of rain on concrete and the hum of distant traffic. Charlotte pulled her coat tighter around her as she led Ethan and Sophie toward the waiting car. A simple black SUV, nondescript, clean, efficient, not flashy, not intimidating. She had asked for that specifically. The driver, an older man with kind eyes and a Red Sox cap, tipped his head respectfully, but didn't comment as he opened the door. Ethan hesitated, his hand tightening slightly around Sophie's small body. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly, glancing sideways at Charlotte. She met his gaze without flinching. "I wouldn't offer if I wasn't," she said simply. "It's just a ride. Nothing more." After a long moment, Ethan nodded. He climbed into the back seat, settling Sophie carefully against him. Charlotte followed, pulling the door shut behind her, with a soft, solid click. The city slipped past outside the windows, a blur of sodium lights and slick pavement. Inside the car, it was warm, quiet. Charlotte sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, stealing glances at Ethan and Sophie out of the corner of her eye. Sophie had stirred briefly when the car moved, blinking up at Ethan with heavy-lidded confusion before burrowing deeper into his chest. Safe. Trusting. The sight squeezed something tender and unguarded inside Charlotte's chest. She cleared her throat softly. "There's a small inn just off Peachtree," she said, keeping her voice casual. "Quiet. Clean. I have a suite reserved there for the night." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "I appreciate it," he said carefully. "But we'll be fine. There's a place I can afford near the highway." Charlotte nodded, her expression unreadable. "I understand," she said. And she did. Pride was a heavy thing. She knew that. She carried her own armor into every boardroom, wore it like a second skin. But tonight wasn't about charity. It wasn't about pity. It was about offering a bridge, quiet and steady, and letting him decide whether to cross. They rode in silence for a few minutes, the tires whispering against the wet streets. Then Charlotte reached into her handbag and pulled out a small card, offering it to him without fanfare. Ethan took it hesitantly. The card was simple: ivory cardstock, elegant navy script. At the top, Hayes Foundation. Below it, a name he didn't recognize: Community Outreach Coordinator, and a phone number. He looked up, confused. Charlotte smiled, soft and a little shy. "We run several programs," she said. "Job placement, vocational training. We just started a new partnership with a local workshop, fixing up old farm equipment, restoring vintage cars. Good, honest work." And Ethan stared at the card, the weight of it settling into his hands heavier than it should have been. A chance, not a handout, not charity, a chance to stand on his own feet, to build something again. "You don't have to decide now," Charlotte said, her voice gentle, "or ever. I just thought, maybe you might want to know it's there." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat thick with a dozen emotions he didn't know how to name. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice low. "Why help me?" Charlotte hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because once," she said, "someone helped me. When I didn't deserve it. When I didn't even know how to ask." She looked out the window, her reflection ghosted against the glass. "And because no one gets through life alone. Not really." The car slowed, turning onto a quieter street lined with towering oaks and soft pools of lamplight. The inn came into view, a quaint brick building with white shutters and a sign that swung gently in the breeze. The Magnolia House. Warm light spilled from the lobby windows. A woman behind the counter smiled and waved as they pulled up. Ethan stared at it, heart pounding. It looked safe. It looked like somewhere Sophie could rest her head without worrying about cockroaches or thin walls or angry shouting in the next room. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Pride and fear and hope tangled inside him, a knot he didn't know how to untangle. Beside him, Sophie stirred again, mumbling something incoherent. He looked down at her, at the way she clutched the bunny Charlotte had given her, even in sleep, at the trust so clear in every soft breath, and something inside him shifted. Maybe accepting help wasn't weakness. Maybe, just maybe, it was another kind of strength. The kind that said, "I'll do whatever it takes for her." He looked up at Charlotte, who was watching him with quiet, patient eyes. "You sure it's okay?" he asked roughly. Charlotte's smile was soft, radiant. "Absolutely." Ethan nodded, feeling something inside him ease for the first time in months. The driver climbed out to get their bags, and Ethan moved carefully, cradling Sophie against him. As he stepped out of the car into the cool Georgia night, the breeze carried the faint scent of magnolias and fresh rain. Charlotte joined him on the sidewalk, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, her hair lifting slightly in the wind. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, meeting her gaze. "For everything." Charlotte tilted her head, her smile deepening. "Don't thank me yet," she teased gently. "You haven't seen the room." Ethan chuckled, a low, rusty sound he hadn't made in far too long. And for the first time in what felt like forever, hope didn't feel like a cruel joke. It felt like something he could reach for. Something real, maybe even something lasting. The following morning dawned muted and gray. The sky stretched taut with thick, low-hanging clouds. Ethan stood by the window of the small inn room, one hand resting lightly against the cool glass, watching as a few early pedestrians hurried down the slick sidewalk, collars pulled high against the biting wind. Inside, the room was simple but warm. Cream-colored walls, a sturdy oak dresser, a queen-size bed tucked under a thick quilt. Sophie still slept soundly, a small cocoon of tangled blankets and soft breathing, the plush bunny clutched tightly in her arms. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the glass. It was the first time in months he hadn't woken with the gnawing anxiety of overdue bills and dead-end jobs. But the stillness unsettled him, too. He wasn't built for waiting. He was built for moving, fixing, doing. A knock sounded at the door, soft, polite. Ethan turned sharply, instinctively shielding Sophie with his body, before reason caught up. He crossed the room and cracked the door open. It was the innkeeper, a cheerful woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a name tag that read, Marilyn. "Morning, Mr. Miller," she said brightly. "There's coffee and fresh pastries downstairs if you and your daughter are hungry. No charge. It's part of your stay." Ethan hesitated. Nothing came free in his world, but Marilyn's smile was genuine, unforced. "Thank you," he said gruffly, feeling awkward. "That's very kind." She waved it off like it was the most natural thing in the world. "If you need anything else, just holler. Weather's turning nasty. Might even get snow tonight." Ethan nodded, his mind already calculating. Snow meant delays, meant construction jobs postponed, meant fewer chances to pick up day labor. He closed the door gently and leaned back against it, scrubbing a hand over his face. They couldn't afford to linger, not even here, not even with Charlotte's quiet offer tucked into his jacket pocket. His eyes strayed to Sophie, small and still so heartbreakingly innocent, and something inside him hardened. He had to do better. Today. By noon, the wind had picked up, rattling the window panes and carrying little bursts of dry leaves down the deserted sidewalks. Ethan bundled Sophie into her coat, a size too small but still serviceable, and headed into town. He asked at every corner store, every gas station, every hardware shop, anywhere that might need a pair of strong hands. But the answers were the same, over and over. "Sorry, buddy, not hiring right now. Maybe check back after the holidays. Bad time of year, you know how it is." Ethan forced a polite smile each time, tugging Sophie's small, mittened hand more tightly into his own. He did know how it was. Too well. By late afternoon, the first tentative flakes of snow were swirling through the air, kissing the ground and vanishing. Sophie's cheeks were pink with cold, her steps dragging. Ethan scooped her into his arms without a word and turned toward the inn, his chest tight with frustration and a heavy, familiar fear. How long could he keep holding everything together? How many more days could he keep promising her it would be okay? His mind flashed to the card Charlotte had given him, tucked safely into the inside pocket of his jacket. An offer he hadn't yet dared to use, not because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't trust himself. Accepting help meant admitting he couldn't do it alone. And that felt dangerously close to failure. The lobby of the Magnolia House was warm and fragrant with cinnamon and coffee when they stepped inside. Marilyn looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "You two look frozen," she said. "Come get some cocoa. Just made a fresh pot." Ethan hesitated only a second before nodding. Sophie's face lit up, and the sight alone made the decision worth it. They settled into a cozy armchair by the fire, Sophie cradling a steaming mug in both hands, her boots dripping little puddles onto the mat below. Ethan sipped his coffee slowly, feeling the heat spread through his frozen fingers, loosening muscles knotted tight all morning. Marilyn bustled over with a small plate of cookies and placed it on the low table between them. "Eat," she said firmly. "Looks like you could both use it." Ethan chuckled under his breath, a rare spark of warmth. Sophie immediately grabbed a cookie, nibbling delicately around the edges like a mouse. For a moment, the world outside faded away. The cold, the job rejections, the invisible weight pressing down on him. It was just a little girl, a warm fire, and kindness that asked for nothing in return. His hand strayed unconsciously to his jacket pocket. The card, the offer, the chance. He stared into the fire, the orange flames licking the logs in slow, hypnotic patterns. What was he waiting for? Pride had carried him this far, but pride alone wouldn't feed Sophie, wouldn't build a home where she could be safe and happy. Maybe it was time to stop surviving. Maybe it was time to start living again. He took a slow, steady breath, feeling the decision settle into his bones. Tomorrow. Tomorrow he would call. Not because he was giving up, but because for the first time in a long time, he could see something beyond the struggle. He could see a future. And maybe, just maybe, Charlotte Hayes was part of it. Outside the inn, the snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing the sidewalks and rooftops in a soft, shimmering white. Inside by the fire, a little girl laughed around a mouthful of cookie, and a man allowed himself to hope again. Just a little. Just enough. The morning sun broke through thin veils of lingering mist, spilling golden light across the sleepy town. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a fresh blanket of snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds across rooftops and sidewalks. Ethan stood outside the workshop, heart pounding. The building itself was unremarkable. A converted old garage tucked behind a row of brick storefronts. A simple wooden sign hung above the door, worn but proud. Heritage Restorations. Honoring the past, building the future. It was the place Charlotte had spoken of. The card from the Hayes Foundation was still tucked into his pocket, now creased and softened from handling. Ethan shifted Sophie higher against his hip, her small arms wrapped trustingly around his neck, and took a breath so deep it scraped the inside of his ribs. He could turn around now. Nobody would blame him. But then Sophie stirred, resting her head against his shoulder, and Ethan knew. This wasn't about fear anymore. It was about her. It was about finally stepping into a future that didn't just survive day by day. A future that built something lasting. He tightened his grip on her and pushed open the door. The inside of the workshop was a warm, living place. The air thick with the rich scent of wood shavings, machine oil, and something faintly sweet, like cinnamon from a forgotten mug of coffee. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, catching motes of dust that danced lazily in the beams. Tools hung neatly on pegboards along the walls. Half-rebuilt engines and gleaming car parts were scattered across wide workbenches alongside old tractors and motorcycles waiting for their second life. At the far end of the room, a man in coveralls, broad-shouldered, silver hair tied back at the nape of his neck, looked up from where he was welding a fender. He flipped up his visor and grinned. "You must be Ethan Miller," he called, his voice a warm rumble that filled the space. Ethan shifted awkwardly. "Yeah," he said. "That's me." The man wiped his hands on a rag and crossed the floor with an easy gait. "Name's Joe Patterson," he said, holding out a hand. "Welcome to Heritage. Charlotte said you might stop by." Ethan shook his hand, the grip firm and honest. There was no pity in Joe's eyes, no judgment, just a quiet, steady acceptance. "You got experience with engines?" Joe asked, nodding toward a half-dismantled truck nearby. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Some," he said. "Did a lot of maintenance work. Fixed farm equipment, old cars when I could get the parts." Joe's grin widened. "Good," he said. "You're not going to find much here that's newer than '78. We believe in breathing life back into things folks thought were too broken to matter." He jerked his chin toward a row of workbenches. "Come on, let's see what you can do." Ethan settled Sophie in a small break room off the main floor, where a battered couch and a battered TV played old cartoons on low volume. Marilyn, the innkeeper, had packed them sandwiches and juice boxes that morning, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a string like a care package. Sophie waved cheerfully as he promised he'd be just a few steps away. For the next few hours, Ethan lost himself in the work, his hands remembering old rhythms, old skills that had never truly left him. There was something almost sacred about it. The clink of wrenches, the slow tightening of bolts, the way the smell of warm metal filled his lungs and cleared the clutter from his mind. Joe worked beside him, offering pointers now and then, but mostly letting him find his own way. The other workers, a small crew of mechanics and apprentices, drifted in and out, greeting Ethan with casual nods, easy smiles. Nobody asked about his past. Nobody cared about the holes worn into his boots or the threadbare jacket he wore. They only cared if he could work hard, if he could be trusted. And that Ethan could do. By noon, his shoulders ached pleasantly, and a smudge of grease streaked across his forearm. Joe clapped him on the back with a meaty hand. "Not bad, Miller," he said with a chuckle. "Not bad at all. How'd you like to stick around for a while?" Ethan blinked, the words slow to sink in. "You serious?" Joe grinned. "Dead serious. We could use a man who knows how to bring these old beasts back to life." Ethan glanced toward the break room where Sophie sat, swinging her legs and singing quietly to herself. He thought about the months, years of scraping by, of saying no to everything because it was safer than hoping. And then he thought about this place, warm, steady, built from second chances. He looked back at Joe and nodded, the decision grounding itself deep inside him. "I'd like that," he said simply. Joe nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. "Good. Start tomorrow. We'll work out the details later. For now, Go take that little girl of yours out for a celebration lunch." Ethan laughed, a full, rich sound that surprised even him. "Yeah," he said, grinning. "Yeah, I think we will." As he gathered Sophie into his arms and stepped back into the crisp afternoon, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Small, but real. The cold wind nipped at his cheeks, but it couldn't touch the warmth unfurling in his chest. They walked down the street toward the diner Marilyn had recommended, Sophie chattering happily about cartoons and Coco and her plans to build a snowman later. And for the first time in a long, long while, Ethan didn't feel like he was running from something. He was running towards something, a future, a home, maybe even a life where hope wasn't a dangerous thing, but a foundation to build upon. As he opened the diner door for Sophie and followed her inside, Ethan allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The first steps were always the hardest, but he was walking them now. And for the first time, he wasn't walking alone. The late afternoon sun bathed the town in a soft, golden glow, casting long shadows across the sidewalks dusted with melting snow. Ethan stood outside the small diner, one hand resting lightly on Sophie's shoulder as she pressed her nose to the glass, peering eagerly at the dessert display inside. He smiled, a real smile this time, and opened the door for her, the little brass bell overhead chiming merrily. The warmth hit them immediately, the scent of coffee, baked bread, and something sweet curling through the air. A waitress in a red apron waved them to a booth near the window. Ethan slid into the seat across from Sophie, feeling more relaxed than he had in months. They ordered grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Comfort food, simple and satisfying. Sophie chatted animatedly between bites, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold, her eyes bright. Ethan listened, answering when he could, but mostly he just watched her. This small, fierce miracle he somehow had the privilege of calling his daughter. He was so absorbed that he almost didn't notice when the bell over the door chimed again. But then he heard the soft, unmistakable click of heels against the worn tile floor. He looked up, and there she was. Charlotte. Dressed simply today. Dark jeans, a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled back into a loose, effortless twist. No boardrooms, no cameras, just her. For a moment, she hesitated by the door, scanning the diner. Her eyes found him almost immediately, and softened. Ethan felt his heart jolt in his chest, a startled, unsteady beat. He lifted a hand in a small wave, feeling suddenly like a teenager fumbling for courage. Charlotte smiled, that same quiet, luminous smile he was beginning to crave, and crossed the room toward them. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, voice light but touched with something shy underneath. Ethan cleared his throat, nudging Sophie slightly. "What do you think, kiddo? Should we let her crash our party?" Sophie giggled and nodded enthusiastically, waving Charlotte into the booth beside her. Charlotte slid in gracefully, setting her purse down and unbuttoning her coat. For a few seconds, they just sat there. Three people who, by all logic, should have been strangers passing through each other's lives, but somehow, impossibly, weren't. They talked over refills of coffee and plates of pie. About little things. The weather, the town's tiny Christmas parade coming up, how Sophie wanted a puppy for Christmas even though their motel had a strict no pets policy. Charlotte listened with a kind of focused attentiveness that made Ethan's chest ache. Not polite interest, real attention, as if everything he said mattered. He found himself telling her things he hadn't meant to, about growing up fixing tractors on his grandfather's farm, about the night he held Sophie for the first time and knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of her. Charlotte listened without interrupting, her chin propped lightly on one hand, her eyes never leaving his face. When she spoke, it wasn't to offer advice or platitudes. It was to share. About her own childhood, more lonely than lavish, filled with silent dinners and empty houses while her parents built their empire. About the first business she started, a disaster she barely survived. And the night she realized success meant nothing if there was no one to come home to. Ethan watched her, something tender unfolding slowly inside him. Here, in the fading afternoon light, she wasn't the billionaire mogul. She was just a woman, brave, brilliant, a little battered at the edges, reaching out across the worn diner table like it was a bridge over a chasm. and somehow, miraculously, he found himself reaching back. Afterward, they walked slowly down the sidewalk together, Sophie skipping ahead, leaving tiny footprints in the thin layer of slush. The sky had turned a dusky lavender, the first stars blinking into existence overhead. Charlotte wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly. Without thinking, Ethan shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, startled. "You'll freeze," she protested. He shrugged. "I'll survive." Charlotte's fingers brushed lightly over the worn denim at her collarbone. "Thank you," she said, so softly he almost didn't hear it. They walked in silence for a while longer, the kind that didn't need filling. At the corner, they stopped. Sophie ran up and grabbed Ethan's hand, her bunny tucked under one arm. Charlotte crouched down, smoothing Sophie's wind-tangled hair back from her face. "You're a brave little girl," she said warmly. "Just like your daddy." Sophie beamed, pure sunshine. Ethan swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat. Charlotte straightened, hesitating. It would be so easy, he thought, to let this end here, with a polite goodbye, a thank you for the pie. Safe, distant. But he didn't want safe anymore. Not with her. "Hey," he said, voice rough with nerves. Maybe we could do this again sometime." Charlotte's smile was slow, radiant. "I'd like that," she said simply. Their eyes held for a moment longer. A tether drawn taut between them, fragile but real. Then Charlotte squeezed his hand once, quick and sure, before turning to walk away down the lamplit street. Ethan watched her go, heart pounding, the borrowed jacket still around her shoulders like a promise. Sophie tugged at his hand, yawning. "Come on, Daddy," she said sleepily. "Let's go home." He looked down at her, this small, fierce light that had kept him going when everything else had fallen apart. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan allowed himself to believe. Maybe home wasn't a place. Maybe it was a person. Or two. Maybe it was the beginning of something he hadn't even known how much he needed. Until now. The following week unfolded like a slow, tentative blossom. Cautious but beautiful. Ethan worked at the restoration shop by day, his hands rough with grease and satisfaction. In the evenings, he and Sophie fell into a new rhythm. Dinners at the inn, homework and cartoons, bundled walks down snow-dusted sidewalks. Sometimes Charlotte joined them. Never expected, never arranged, just appeared. A smile across a diner booth, a laugh over shared cocoa. Each encounter stitching them closer in ways none of them dared name aloud. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the faint, fragile beginning of belonging. And it terrified him, because deep down, a voice he thought he had long buried still whispered, "Men like you don't get women like her." It was a Saturday afternoon when the past caught up with him. The shop was quiet, sunlight pooling across the concrete floor. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, stepping out back to catch a breath of cold, crisp air. That's when he saw him, Cal Barker, lean, sharp-eyed, grinning that lazy, mocking grin Ethan had come to despise years ago. Cal leaned against the fence, a cigarette dangling from his fingers, wearing the same beaten leather jacket he always had. The uniform of a man who never grew up, never grew better. "Well, well," Cal drawled, pushing off the fence. "Look who's gone all respectable." Ethan stiffened, instincts roaring to life. "What do you want, Cal?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Careful." Cal shrugged, tossing the cigarette onto the pavement and grinding it under his boot. "Just passing through. Heard you were shacking up with some rich lady now. Thought I'd see for myself." Ethan's stomach twisted. "I'm not shacking up with anyone," he said tightly, "and it's none of your business." Cal laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped across the cold air. "Come on, Miller. You think she's really going to stick around once she sees the dirt under your fingernails? Once she figures out you're just a broke, busted-up mechanic with a kid hanging off his hip?" Ethan clenched his fists at his sides, the words landing harder than he wanted to admit. "You don't know her," he said, jaw tight. "No," Cal said, his smile curdling. "But I know you." And there it was, the old shame, rising like bile in his throat. All the jobs he'd lost. All the nights he'd gone to bed wondering if he was enough for Sophie. All the times he'd looked in the mirror and seen nothing but failure. He thought he had outrun it. He thought he had built something better. But standing there in the brittle winter light, he wasn't so sure anymore. "You don't belong in her world, Ethan," Cal said, voice almost pitying now. "You never will." With a final smirk, he turned and sauntered off, disappearing into the maze of alleyways beyond the lot. Ethan stood frozen for a long moment, the cold gnawing at him, the rag dangling forgotten from his hand. Somewhere deep inside, a small, cruel voice whispered, "Maybe he's right." That evening, Ethan didn't show up at the diner. Charlotte waited at their usual booth, watching the door with quiet, growing worry as the minutes stretched into hours. She finally left, the chill of the night seeping into her coat no matter how tightly she wrapped it around herself. The next day, Ethan didn't come to work. Joe shrugged it off. "Probably needed a day. We've all been there." But Charlotte's heart tightened anyway. She tried calling. No answer. Tried texting. No reply. By Monday morning, when Ethan still hadn't appeared, Charlotte drove to the Magnolia House, the tires of her car crunching over the thin sheet of ice frosting the parking lot. She found Marilyn at the front desk, arranging a small display of holiday postcards. Marilyn looked up, her warm smile faltering slightly when she saw Charlotte's face. "You looking for Ethan?" she asked gently. Charlotte nodded, throat thick. Marilyn sighed, setting down the postcards. "They checked out early this morning. Said they had someplace else to be." Charlotte's stomach dropped. "Did he leave a message?" Marilyn hesitated, then reached under the counter and pulled out a small envelope. "He asked me to give you this, if you came by." Charlotte took it with trembling fingers, the paper light but unbearably heavy in her hand. She stepped outside, the cold wind slapping color into her cheeks, and opened it. The note inside was short, painfully so. "Charlotte, thank you for everything, but you deserve someone who can stand beside you without dragging you down. Take care of yourself. Ethan." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Around her, the town bustled on, oblivious, uncaring. She folded the note carefully, pressing it to her chest for a long, aching moment. Then, with slow, steady steps, Charlotte walked back to her car. The world felt heavier now, colder. But somewhere deep inside, a small ember of stubborn hope refused to die, because Charlotte Hayes had built her life by not giving up, and she wasn't about to start now. Not on Ethan, not on the fragile, precious thing they had only just begun to build. Not when she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that the best things in life were always the ones you had to fight for. The late afternoon was slipping into twilight, the winter sun casting long, cold shadows across the town. Charlotte tightened her scarf against the biting wind, her steps brisk but uncertain, as she moved through the narrow back streets where Ethan had once said he stayed when times were hard. She had no plan, no address, just a stubborn, aching belief that she would find him. Because you didn't let people walk away when they mattered. You went after them. She turned a corner and spotted a battered old pickup parked beside a crumbling motel, the kind with peeling paint, flickering neon signs, and curtains that didn't quite close. And standing beside it, struggling to load a duffel bag while balancing Sophie against his hip, was Ethan. For a moment, Charlotte just stood there, her breath misting in the cold air. He looked so tired. Not just physically, though there were new lines etched around his eyes, but soul tired, like a man carrying a weight far too heavy for one person to bear. Sophie noticed her first. Her small face lit up, and she wriggled, waving a mittened hand. "Miss Charlotte!" Ethan turned, and when his eyes met hers, something raw and pained flickered there. He shifted Sophie protectively on his hip and set the duffel down slowly. Charlotte crossed the icy parking lot toward them, every step measured, every heartbeat loud in her ears. When she stopped a few feet away, she spoke first, voice steady despite the storm inside her. "You didn't even say goodbye." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It was easier that way." "For who?" Charlotte asked gently. Ethan looked down at Sophie, smoothing her hat with careful hands. "For her," he said hoarsely. "For you." Charlotte shook her head, tears burning the backs of her eyes. "You don't get to decide that for me." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. When he spoke again, his voice was rough, low. "You deserve better, Charlotte. Someone who doesn't come with all this baggage. Someone who fits into your world." Charlotte stepped closer, her boots crunching softly over the frozen ground. My world, she echoed. Ethan, do you even know what my world is? He opened his mouth, but no words came. She smiled. Not bitter, not sad, just true. My world is a penthouse I come home to alone. Empty rooms, empty victories. That's not a world, Ethan. That's a cage. She reached out slowly, carefully, and placed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart. His breath hitched. I don't care where you come from, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I don't care how much money you have or don't have. I care about this. She pressed her hand gently, feeling the steady, wild beat beneath her palm. This is the only thing that matters. Ethan stood frozen, Sophie silent against him, her big eyes wide and solemn. You think you're not enough, Charlotte whispered. But to her, she nodded toward Sophie. And to me, you're more than enough. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft whistle of the winter wind and the distant hum of passing cars. Finally, slowly, Ethan shifted Sophie into one arm and lifted his free hand to cover Charlotte's where it rested against his heart. His fingers were rough, calloused, trembling slightly, but his grip was sure. You scare me, he said quietly. Charlotte smiled through the sting of tears. You scare me too. He huffed a broken laugh, the first real one she'd heard from him in days. Then with a tenderness that unraveled something deep inside her, Ethan lowered Sophie to the ground. The little girl immediately latched onto Charlotte's leg, hugging her fiercely. Charlotte bent down, gathering Sophie into her arms, holding her close as the child's warmth seeped into her cold skin. When she straightened, Ethan was watching her. Not with fear now, but with something else. Hope, tentative, fragile, blindingly real. He stepped closer, his voice low, full of wonder and terror all at once. Are you sure about this? Charlotte met his gaze without hesitation. I've never been more sure of anything. And for the first time, Ethan let the walls around his heart crack. Not just for Sophie, not just for survival, but for himself, for the possibility of something more. Something whole. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Charlotte's cheek, his fingers lingering in a touch that said all the things words couldn't. Okay, he whispered. Okay. Charlotte's breath shuddered out, and she smiled wide and radiant, as Sophie giggled between them. They stood there, three souls wrapped in a fragile, growing circle of warmth, while the winter world spun cold and glittering around them. They had no map, no guarantees, but they had each other. And sometimes, that was enough to build a whole new life from. One heartbeat at a time. Spring crept slowly into the small town, brushing color into the bare branches and coaxing daffodils up from the thawing earth. Ethan stood on the front porch of the modest little house just off Main Street, a hammer dangling loosely from one hand, a half-finished flower box at his feet. The house wasn't grand, white siding a little faded, shutters slightly crooked, but it had a sturdy roof, a yard just big enough for a swing set, and windows that caught the afternoon sun in golden patches. It was theirs, or would be soon enough. Sophie ran across the lawn barefoot, laughing, chasing after a kite Charlotte had bought her, bright red and blue against the soft blue sky. Ethan watched her, something achingly tender rising in his chest. A few months ago, he hadn't dared dream of this, of roots, of warmth, of mornings that didn't start with fear. And now, here he was. Home. Charlotte stepped out onto the porch behind him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one, her fingers brushing his with casual, electric familiarity. He smiled, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. You know, he said, you're terrible at flying kites. Charlotte laughed, a warm, musical sound that wrapped around him like sunlight. I don't think Sophie minds, she said, nodding toward the yard where Sophie was now spinning in dizzy circles, the kite forgotten. No, Ethan agreed, voice soft. She doesn't mind at all. They stood side by side, sipping coffee, watching the child who had, in her own fierce way, stitched their fractured lives together. After a moment, Charlotte set her mug down on the railing. I have something for you, she said, slipping her hand into the pocket of her jeans. Ethan raised an eyebrow, curious. She pulled out a small, slightly battered key, the brass worn smooth from years of use. Ethan frowned, confused. Charlotte placed it gently into his palm. "It's the key to the shop," she said quietly. "Joe's retiring next month. He wants you to take over." Ethan stared at her, heart pounding. "Me?" he croaked. Charlotte smiled, eyes shining. "You," she said. "You've already built it back stronger than it ever was. You've given those old machines, and a lot of old dreams, a second life." Ethan looked down at the key, the weight of it anchoring him, grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. He closed his fingers around it carefully, like something precious. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. "Say yes," Charlotte whispered. He looked up, meeting her gaze. And he did, not just to the shop, but to all of it. To the home, to the life, to the terrifying, beautiful hope she held out to him. "Yes," he said simply. Charlotte's face lit up, radiant. She leaned in, standing on tiptoe, and brushed a kiss against his lips. Soft, certain, full of every promise neither of them had dared speak. Sophie whooped from the yard, clapping her hands and spinning in gleeful circles. Ethan laughed, wrapping his arm around Charlotte's waist and pulling her close. It wasn't perfect. There would still be hard days and fears and moments when the past tried to whisper doubts into their hearts. But they had chosen each other, chosen to stay, chosen to believe. And that, Ethan realized as he watched Charlotte's face tilt up to the light, as he listened to Sophie's laughter bubbling into the spring air. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills and painted the sky in streaks of orange and violet, they sat on the porch steps. Ethan, Charlotte, and Sophie. A tangle of legs and laughter and shared warmth. The wind stirred the chimes hanging by the door, a soft, lilting song. Sophie curled up between them, her bunny clutched loosely in one hand, her head nodding against Ethan's shoulder. Charlotte reached across and took Ethan's hand, twining their fingers together. No grand declarations, no need for them. Just this quiet, steady knowing. Home wasn't a building. It wasn't a town, or a job, or a bank account. Home was where the people you loved waited for you, where you were seen, truly seen, and still chosen, where your heart could finally rest, not because everything was perfect, but because it was real, because it was yours. And as the stars blinked to life overhead, and the night wrapped itself around their little family like a soft, sacred quilt, Ethan Miller knew, with a certainty that left him breathless, he was exactly where he was meant to be, where the heart belongs, always. Before you go, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Leave a comment and share a little piece of your world with us. It's always amazing to see how stories like this can connect hearts across so many places. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring journeys like this one. Your support means the world and helps us continue sharing stories that matter. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and remember, sometimes the smallest moments lead to the greatest changes.